In the rain-soaked streets of a forgotten industrial city, a mafia boss faces every criminal's deepest fear: the mortality of his child. His son lies in a hospital bed, his kidneys failing, his time measured in weeks. The boss has built his empire on control, on the certainty that money and power can solve anything. But medicine has limits. Desperation has no limits. In that same city, in a cramped diner on the corner of 5th and Main, a waitress named Clara works double shifts to pay rent. She's invisible to the world. A woman whose kindness is mistaken for weakness, whose exhaustion is mistaken for laziness. She donates plasma twice a month for extra cash, signs every medical form without reading, trusts the system to protect her. She has no idea that her body is about to become the instrument of salvation for a child she will never meet. When a kidney becomes available through channels that operate in shadow, no one asks questions about consent. The transplant saves the boy's life. The boss's relief is absolute, his gratitude private and fierce. He believes he has purchased a miracle. He believes the rules still apply to him. He does not know that the woman whose organ now beats with his son's blood is about to pay the price for his desperation. This is a story about what happens when compassion becomes the only currency that matters. When a man built on violence discovers that he is indebted to grace. When a waitress's sacrifice becomes the crack in a fortress he spent decades constructing. This is the story of how a single act of unknowing kindness forces a criminal to confront the humanity he thought he had already sold. Chapter 1. The Fear Behind the Throne. The boy's name was Marco, and he was 17. He had his father's sharp jaw, but his mother's gentle eyes, a combination that suggested he might have become something other than a criminal. That was the luxury the boy would never have. His father had decided his destiny long ago, the way fathers with power decide things. Marco had accepted this the way children accept the worlds they're born into, as inevitable, as natural law, as simply the way things were. But the diagnosis changed everything. It came on a Tuesday morning, in a private hospital room overlooking the city, with a doctor who wore expensive glasses and spoke in the measured tones of someone trained to deliver catastrophic news without losing composure. Kidney failure, progressive, irreversible. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never settle. The dialysis would start immediately. The transplant list was long, 18 months, possibly 2 years, if a match ever appeared. The prognosis was manageable, but not optimistic. The boy would survive, but survival would look like afternoons, tethered to machines, like a life slowly compressed into smaller and smaller spaces. Like hope eroding with each passing month. Marco's mother, Elena, sat in the corner of the room. She had been beautiful once, before grief had taught her how to disappear into the background of her own life. She held her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. Victor Corsini, the boy's father, stood at the window. His hands were in his pockets, his face was immobile. But inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 23 years was beginning to crack. Victor was 51 years old. He had controlled the port district for more than 2 decades. He decided which shipments arrived, which disappeared, which hands were allowed to profit. He had ordered 9 men dead without raising his voice above the level of normal conversation. He had orchestrated the collapse of 3 rival families with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra through a symphony only he could hear. Power was his native language, and he had become fluent in violence, leverage, the art of making problems vanish, the mathematics of fear. But Marco was not a problem that could be erased. Marco was the only soft thing in his life, the only reason he had not become completely hollow, the only person who looked at him without calculation or fear. When Marco was born, Victor had felt something shift. A small opening in the fortress he had built around his heart. He had vowed that his son would have a different life. That promise had sustained him through 18 years of blood and corruption. Now that promise was becoming impossible to keep. Victor drove home alone that night. The rain fell hard against the windshield, and the wipers beat a steady rhythm that felt like a countdown. He sat in traffic on the bridge, watching the city lights reflect on the wet asphalt below, and understood for the first time that his money could not buy time. His connections could not buy healing. His reputation meant nothing to biology. His power, which had seemed absolute, was absolutely useless. The fear he felt was not the fear of death. He had made peace with that long ago, the way men who have killed learn to make peace with their own mortality. This fear was something else. This was the fear of helplessness, the fear of being a king with no power, the fear of discovering that everything he had built was built on a foundation that was never stable enough to support what mattered most. He made a call that night. One call. To a doctor named Castellano, a man he had kept on retainer for 15 years. Castellano was the kind of doctor who understood that medical ethics were a luxury for the wealthy and honest, and Corsini was neither. "I need you to find me a kidney," Victor said. His voice was calm, which was how he sounded when he was most dangerous. "A perfect match for my son. I don't care how. I don't care where it comes from. I don't care what it costs. You have 1 week." "Mr. Corsini," the doctor began carefully. 1 week, Victor repeated and hung up. Castellano understood. Castellano always understood. Within 72 hours, he had located a donor, a woman, young, healthy, someone the system had already decided was disposable, someone who could be convinced to give what was not really hers to give. Victor didn't ask the details. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask how she had been convinced. He didn't ask what lies had been told about the procedure, about the risks, about what she was actually surrendering. The machinery of his world operated in darkness, and darkness was how he kept his hands clean. Or so he told himself. The surgery was performed at dawn on Thursday in a private clinic outside the city limits. 20 minutes after the kidney was placed in Marco's body, it began to function. The boy's blood filtered. His body began to recognize itself again. By evening, the fever was breaking. By the next morning, he was asking for water, asking for real food, asking about going home. Victor sat beside his son's hospital bed and felt something crack open inside him. Not his hardness, which had been calcifying for decades, but his certainty. He had saved Marco's life using the same machinery that had destroyed so many others. He had bought his son's future with someone else's body. He had done what every father would do. He had done what no decent man should. He reached down and held Marco's hand, thin, still pale but warm. Alive. His son was alive. He told himself not to think about the cost. He told himself it was over. He told himself that this was the price of the life he had chosen, and it was a price he had always known he would have to pay. He told himself that the woman, whoever she was, wherever she was, whatever was happening to her body now, had been compensated, that she had agreed, that this was simply how the world worked for people like them. But something in him had shifted. Something that had been calcified for so many years was beginning to thaw, and thawing was more painful than he could have anticipated. It was a pain that would not stop. Chapter 2. The Invisible Woman. Clara had worked at Mancini's diner for 8 years. She could work that place in her sleep, and some nights, exhausted, running on coffee and the muscle memory of kindness, she wondered if she was. She knew every booth, every crack in the red vinyl seats, the way the left side of the third booth had a spring that poked up if you sat too far back. She knew the coffee maker groaned when it was about to break. She knew which regulars took their eggs over easy and which ones wanted them fried hard. which old men came in at 5 in the morning because their wives had died and silence at home was unbearable, which nurses collapsed into the corner table after 12-hour night shifts with the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could repair. She had learned, over those 8 years, how to be invisible in a way that made people comfortable. She was a mirror that reflected their needs back at them without asking anything in return. She was useful. She was unthreatening. She was there and not there at the same time. She was the kind of woman that men looked through instead of at, which was exactly what she had learned to want. Her apartment was a studio on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old cooking and resignation. The refrigerator hummed all night, a sound she had learned to sleep through. The water-stained walls had stopped bothering her years ago. There was a window that looked out onto a fire escape, and sometimes she sat there in the evenings watching the city darken and tried to remember if she had ever wanted more than this. The work paid enough to keep her above water, which meant not drowning but never quite reaching the surface. The tips depended on smiling, on forgetting when someone's hands lingered too long on her arm or the small of her back, on pretending not to notice when men looked at her with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. She had become expert at these small erasures. She had learned that kindness could be a form of invisibility, that if you smiled enough, people stopped seeing you entirely. Twice a month, on Thursdays after her shift, she went to the plasma donation center on the south side of the city. The center operated out of a converted warehouse, fluorescent lights giving everything a sickly yellow cast. The waiting room was always full of people who looked like Clara, people who needed money more than they needed their blood, who had decided that their bodies were resources to be extracted, that this was a fair exchange. It was easy money, quick money, $500 for a 2-hour appointment, no judgment. They said thousands of people did it. They said it was safe. They said her blood was valuable. What they didn't say was what happened if complications arose, if the extraction process revealed underlying conditions, if your body turned out to be damaged in ways that weren't immediately apparent. She had been donating for 5 years. In that time, she had given plasma twice a month, every month, without missing once. She had never read the forms carefully. The words were too small. The waiting room too cold, the nurses too rushed, and she was always too tired. She would press her thumb to the consent forms and let them take what they needed. The money would go into her account, and she would go back to the diner the next day. On the Thursday that changed everything, Clara was running a fever. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her skin felt too tight, in the thickness at the back of her throat. Her lymph nodes were swollen. She could feel the lumps along her neck when she pressed her fingers there. She mentioned this to the nurse at the intake desk, mentioned it the way you mention minor inconveniences, half apologetic, as if her body's protest was something she should apologize for. The nurse's name was Jennifer. She was young, maybe 25, and she looked like someone who was already regretting her career choices. The clinic was understaffed, underfunded, and operating under pressure from sources above her pay grade. She didn't run the usual tests. She cleared Clara anyway. They were short on donations that week. The list of waiting patients was long. People who needed the proteins, the antibodies, the cellular components that came from donated plasma. Money was involved. Quotas existed. Compassion was a luxury. "You'll be fine," Jennifer said, more to convince herself than Clara. "Just the flu. Could be you're already fighting it off." Clara lay in the donation chair. The needle was inserted into her arm with practiced precision. She watched her blood flow through the machine that would separate plasma from cells, cell from need, body from profit. She didn't feel well. Her head was pounding. Her vision felt slightly blurred. But she needed the money. The procedure took 2 hours. When it was finished, they gave her $60 in cash, a bottle of water, and a warning to drink lots of fluids and rest. She didn't rest. She had a shift at the diner starting in 2 hours. 2 hours later, she left with $60 and a dizziness, she told herself, would fade. It didn't. It became worse. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unknowing. The call came from the clinic a week later. Clara was at the diner, balancing 6 plates up her left arm. Eggs over easy. Hash browns, wheat toast, a grilled cheese with tomato, 2 omelettes with mushrooms and cheese. When her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, she set the plates down carefully, one hand supporting from underneath, the practiced motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The phone screen showed an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of the lunch rush. The diner was loud, with the sounds of coffee being poured, conversations overlapping, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. But something made her answer. The nurse was speaking quickly, officially, in the tone people use when they're delivering news they've been trained to deliver without emotion, but also without taking real responsibility for it. Her name was different this time. Not Jennifer. Someone higher up the chain. "Your blood work came back with some concerns," the nurse said. "We need you to come in." "Concerns?" Clara moved toward the back of the diner, pressing the phone closer to her ear. "What kind of concerns?" "Elevated enzyme levels, possibly from an infection. Nothing serious, probably. We just need to run some additional tests. Can you come in tomorrow?" Clara said yes, but her voice changed. Something shifted in her chest. She finished her shift on autopilot. She poured coffee without tasting it. She smiled at customers without seeing them. The invisible woman became even more invisible. She didn't mention it to anyone. She couldn't afford to miss shifts if they wanted her to go to a hospital. She couldn't afford the tests if she had to pay out of pocket. She couldn't afford to be sick, so she didn't go to the clinic. She went to work. She kept going to work even as the fever returned, even as the swelling in her lymph nodes got worse, even as her energy began to drain away like water through a cracked vessel. 2 weeks later, during the dinner rush, she was carrying 4 plates in each hand, a trick she had perfected over 8 years, when her vision suddenly blurred. The room tilted. The floor rushed toward her. She collapsed between table 4 and the kitchen door. The plates shattered against the tile, and for a moment there was that strange silence before someone starts screaming, the sound of her body hitting the ground, the sound of broken dishes, the sound of Giuseppe shouting her name. Giuseppe was 64 years old. He had owned the diner for 31 years. He had seen waitresses come and go, but Clara had always been different. Clara had always stayed. He called an ambulance, and he held Clara's hand while they waited, and he told her everything was going to be okay, even though he didn't believe it. Clara woke up in the county hospital with an IV in her arm, and a doctor explaining that her kidney function was severely compromised. There had been a medical error at the plasma center, a screening failure. She had been accepted for donation while carrying a latent infection. The extraction process, combined with the underlying infection, had damaged her kidneys. "It's not common," the doctor said carefully, the way doctors say things when they're trying to minimize liability. "But it does happen. We see cases like this, maybe 1 or 2 a year. Your other kidney is compensating, but there's been significant injury. We'll need to monitor you carefully. You may have lifelong complications." Clara lay in the hospital bed and felt her life contract. She was 32 years old. She had thought she was being careful. She had thought the system protected people like her. She had thought her body was hers to give. She had thought that if you were cautious, if you didn't take risks, you would be okay. She didn't know that the kidney they had taken wasn't plasma. She didn't know that somewhere in the city, a 17-year-old boy was waking up each morning in a hospital bed, his fever breaking, his blood being filtered by her organ, his cells singing with the rhythm of her sacrifice. She didn't know that she had saved a life she would never be permitted to know. She didn't know that the price of his survival was measured in the years of her own health that were being stolen from her day by day, cell by cell. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel, because Clara's story is about to intersect with a man who controls an empire built on secrets, and one secret is about to destroy everything he thought he understood about power. Chapter 4. The recovery and the first doubt. Marco came home from the hospital on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was high and cold, filtered through clouds that hung low over the city like a weight. Victor had ordered everything prepared. The penthouse cleaned with obsessive precision, the kitchen stocked with the best food money could buy, doctors on call 24 hours, nurses scheduled in shifts. Everything was arranged for the boy's return to life. Marco walked through the apartment like he was relearning the space after a long absence, even though he had lived here his entire life. He was weak, still, his body still learning to trust itself, but healing. The new kidney had taken perfectly, no rejection episodes, no complications. The rejection medications would be lifelong. A reminder that his survival depended on suppressing his own immune system's attempt to destroy this foreign organ inside him. But the doctors said he had years ahead, a future. Something his father had purchased at a cost Victor still couldn't fully articulate, even to himself. "Thank you," Marco said to his father. They stood at the window of the penthouse looking out over the city. Rain was beginning, fat drops falling slowly, as if the sky itself was reluctant to release them. "For everything, for saving me." Victor put his hand on his son's shoulder. The boy was so thin, so fragile underneath the clothes that hung loosely on his frame, so impossibly alive in a way that felt miraculous and terrifying in equal measure. "I would do anything for you," Victor said. And it was true. It was also the beginning of his unraveling. Those words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. They contained a promise that would demand everything from him. That night, alone in his office, Victor made another call to Castellano. It was a call he knew he shouldn't make, but something in him had shifted. Some carefully maintained wall had developed a crack, and through that crack, things were beginning to leak through. Doubts, questions, a voice that sounded like conscience. "The donor," Victor said. His voice was quiet. "The woman. Tell me about her." There was a long silence on the line. Castellano was a smart man. He understood what was happening. "There's no need," the doctor said carefully. "The transplant was successful. Your son is healthy. The arrangement is concluded. These things are better left alone." "I'm not asking your opinion," Victor said quietly. The tone was the same tone he used when he was ordering someone's death. "I'm telling you to tell me. Now." There was another silence. Then the doctor spoke quickly, minimizing everything, trying to compress the truth into something small enough that it might be ignored. A woman, young, healthy before the procedure, from the plasma center, compensated generously for her donation, no complications expected. A routine procedure. Victor listened to the lies embedded in the truthful words. "No complications for the boy," he said. "What about for her?" "The extraction of a kidney is a significant surgical procedure," Castellano said. "There are always risks. Most donors experience full recovery." "That's not what I asked," Victor interrupted. "I asked what happened to her." "There was infection," Castellano said finally. "Apparently she was carrying an infection when we extracted. It compromised her remaining kidney. Her function is diminished. Nothing permanent, the medical evaluations suggest, but she will require monitoring." Victor closed his eyes. He understood what had happened. His doctor had taken from a woman who was already vulnerable, had taken without checking, without caring, because there was a price on the extraction, and the price didn't include conscience. "Her name," Victor said. "Tell me her name." "Mr. Corsini." "Her name," Victor repeated. "I'm not asking you to refuse me." "Clara Marino," Castellano said. "That's all I have. That's all I was given." Victor hung up and sat in the dark of his office. The city lights reflected through the windows, casting his shadow across the wall, a shadow that looked like it belonged to a larger man, a darker man, a man whose crimes were finally beginning to catch up with him. He told himself that it was over. He told himself not to think about it. He told himself that this was the nature of the world he inhabited. Some people won, some people lost, and the line between them was drawn by power and circumstance, by luck and birth, and the random cruelty of systems designed to feed on the vulnerable. But something in him knew that this comfort was a lie. Something in him, small and persistent as a heartbeat, was beginning to demand that he face what he had done. Chapter 5. The girl who couldn't afford to be sick. Clara was released from the hospital after 5 days. The bill they sent her was $17,000. She laughed when she saw it, a sound without joy, a sound like someone watching the ground open beneath her feet and understanding finally that there was no bottom. The letter was formatted with legal precision. The amounts were listed in categories: emergency room visit, diagnostic imaging, lab work, medication, hospital bed. Each line item was a sentence in an indictment against her own body for having the audacity to fail. Giuseppe was kind. He let her come back to work after a week, but the work was different now. She tired easily. By the middle of a shift, her hands would start to shake. Her lower back would ache in a way that made bending to the lower tables an exercise in humiliation. She would have to grip the edge of the booth and pull herself back up. And she would catch the concern in Giuseppe's eyes and feel shame wash through her. She took ibuprofen every 4 hours and smiled through the pain because she had no other choice. She still had rent. She still had to eat. She still had to exist in a world that had decided her body was disposable. The plasma center sent her a letter a month after her release. The envelope was thick, official-looking. Inside was a settlement offer, $2,000, an apology buried in legal language, dense paragraphs written by lawyers whose job was to make horrible things sound reasonable, a non-disclosure agreement, a waiver that said she couldn't talk about what happened, couldn't warn other people, couldn't say the center's name. She took the money. She took the silence along with it. $2,000 would pay for 3 months of rent. After that, she didn't know. In the evenings, she sat in her apartment and looked at the blood work on her kitchen table. The papers were thin and brittle, printed with numbers that had become the coordinates of her suffering. Her remaining kidney was functioning at 70% capacity. The damage was permanent. The doctors had said she should expect dialysis within 10 to 15 years, maybe sooner if she stressed her body too much. Maybe sooner if she kept working, kept moving, kept trying to live. She was 32 years old. She had no savings. She had no family. Her parents had died when she was young, and she had learned early how to be alone. She had no partner, no one to share the weight of this. She had a job that was becoming harder to do with each passing day, and a body that was slowly failing her, and a lifetime of medical complications stretched out in front of her like a sentence. At night, she would lie in bed and feel the dull ache in her side where her kidney was working overtime, filtering all the waste her body produced, struggling to keep up. She would press her hand against her side and imagine the organ inside her, scarred now, damaged, diminished. She would imagine it working itself to death to keep her alive. She didn't know that in the penthouse across the city, in rooms that overlooked the same rain-soaked city she could see from her fire escape, a boy was sleeping peacefully. She didn't know that his dreams were uninterrupted by pain, that his blood was filtering through a kidney that had cost him nothing and cost her everything. She didn't know that somewhere above the city, a 17-year-old boy was healing with her cells, growing stronger with her sacrifice, living a future that had been purchased with her suffering. She didn't know that she had become collateral damage in a transaction she'd never agreed to. She didn't know that her sacrifice was about to teach a man about the price of power. Chapter 6. The Revelation in the Rain. It took Victor 3 weeks to find her. He used the resources he always used, people who knew people, favors called in, a network of information that operated in the margins of the city, in the spaces where legal and illegal blended into something indistinguishable. The clinic eventually gave him a name when enough money changed hands. Clara Marino, 32. A studio apartment on the south side, worked at Mancini's diner. Victor didn't know why he needed to find her. He told himself it was to ensure her silence, to guarantee she wouldn't become a problem, to manage the situation the way he managed all situations. Through money, through leverage, through control. But when he stood outside the diner on a Tuesday morning, the rain falling soft and steady, watching through the windows as she moved through the breakfast crowd with exhausted grace, he understood that was a lie. She was so small, so utterly ordinary. She moved like someone carrying weight that should have broken her, but it hadn't. She was still standing, she was still smiling, she was still showing up. Victor watched her for an hour. He watched her refill coffee cups with steady hands, even though he could see the slight tremor in her fingers. He watched her listen to an old man talk about his dead wife for the 3rd time that week. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't rush him. She simply listened, the way listening was an act of kindness. He watched her bring a troubled teenager an extra piece of pie, unpaid, unseen by the owner. He watched her clean up a spill made by a customer, not with resentment but with care, as if the customer's discomfort mattered to her. He watched her be kind in a world that was only taking from her. That night, alone in his office again, he had another conversation with Castellano. The donor suffered complications, Victor said. It wasn't a question. Minor complications, the doctor said quickly. Kidney damage, not unexpected. Fully anticipated risk. The compensation. She was sick, Victor interrupted. His voice was quiet, which meant he was serious. When you took the kidney, you took it from a sick woman. There was silence on the line. In that silence, everything was confirmed. Victor understood then what he had done. Not in the abstract, not in the language of transactions and arrangements, in the careful distance that power maintained from its own consequences, in the specific, terrible reality of it. He had bought his son's life with a woman's health. He had taken from her without asking. He had used the machinery of his power, money, doctors, the assumption that the powerful could help themselves to anything, to transform her body into a resource, her suffering into the price of his son's survival. The kidney inside Marco was beating with the rhythm of her sacrifice. For the first time in 23 years, Victor Corsini felt something that resembled remorse, not regret. Regret was for people who wished they had made different choices. This was something else. This was the realization that he had committed an atrocity wearing the mask of love, that he had hurt someone not out of cruelty, but out of love for his son, and that this made it somehow worse, not better. That love was no excuse for the machinery of harm, for the extractive relationships he had built his entire life upon. He made a decision then. It wasn't a wise decision. It wasn't a safe decision within the logic of his world. It was dangerous and unprecedented, and potentially ruinous. It was the first truly honest thing he had done in 23 years. He arranged a meeting with Giuseppe, the diner owner. They met in a small office above the restaurant, neutral ground between the legitimate world and the criminal one. Victor had done business with Giuseppe's family decades ago. Nothing serious, nothing that required violence, just the normal corruption that kept the city functioning. "I need a favor," Victor said. They were sitting in Giuseppe's cramped office, surrounded by invoices and schedules, the infrastructure of an ordinary life. "I need you to help me." I'm listening, Giuseppe said carefully. He had learned to listen carefully around powerful men. Listening was how you stayed alive. The waitress, Clara, she's been having some health problems. Victor paused. I know that she's been dealing with them. I know that she won't let you reduce her hours or help her. I know that she's too proud or too scared or too something to accept help. Giuseppe nodded slowly. That's right. She's not the same since she got sick, but she's stubborn. She needs medical care, Victor said. The best care. Specialists, tests, whatever she needs. I want you to arrange it. Tell her it's from the diner's insurance. Something that just came through, retroactive benefits. Tell her whatever you need to tell her, but she needs to get help. That's going to be expensive, Giuseppe said. I know, Victor said. Send me the bills. Giuseppe was quiet for a long time. He was old enough to understand what was happening, that a man built on violence was making a choice that didn't make sense within the logic of his own empire. That meant something had broken inside him. That meant something had changed. That meant a powerful man was beginning to understand that there were debts that couldn't be paid with money, only acknowledged. I'll take care of her, Giuseppe said finally. But Victor, this doesn't fix what happened. This doesn't make her well. This doesn't undo the damage. I know, Victor said, but it's what I can do. But Victor understood that it wasn't enough. Taking care of her financially was atonement for the city, a way of managing the situation so it wouldn't spiral into consequences. He needed something else. He needed to face her. He needed her to know, and in knowing, he needed to know if redemption was even possible for a man like him. He needed to understand if he could ever be anything other than what he had built himself into. Chapter 7. The architecture of guilt. Victor stopped sleeping. He sat in his study at 3 a.m, 4 a.m, 5 a.m, whiskey untouched on the desk beside him, understanding the geometry of his own damnation. He was a man who had built his entire existence on the premise that power was the only language that mattered. Power spoke. Power decided. Power took what it needed and didn't ask permission. But he had created that language. He had spoken it into being with every order, every threat, every moment he had chosen control over conscience. And now that language was trapping him. Now it was the only words he knew, and they were all inadequate. They couldn't undo, they couldn't repair, they could only take, and taking was all he had ever learned to do. He thought about Marco, his son, the boy he had saved. The boy was healing perfectly, his energy returning, his color improving. He was talking about going back to school, about taking his recovery seriously, about maybe studying architecture, about a life that might actually be different from the one Victor had mapped out for him at birth. The boy had been given something that most children never receive, the possibility of choosing his own path, of becoming someone other than his father's legacy. And that life was built on Clara's suffering. Every moment of Marco's health was a moment of her diminishment. Every year of his future would be mapped against the years she was losing. Victor made an appearance at his office one morning. His lieutenants looked at him carefully. They could sense something was wrong. Something had shifted in the machinery of power. He made some decisions about shipments, about distribution channels, about the normal business of his organization. But his heart wasn't in it. His heart was somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want to go, facing truths he had spent his entire life avoiding. He arranged a meeting with the owner of the diner, Giuseppe, an old man who had somehow maintained his dignity and his humanity despite operating on the margins of the city's underworld. When they sat across from each other in Giuseppe's cramped office above the diner, surrounded by the sounds of work happening below them, Victor felt the weight of what he was about to do. "She needs to know," Victor said. "Know what?" Giuseppe asked, but he already knew. "About the kidney, about my son, about everything." "That's going to hurt her," Giuseppe said. "Yes," Victor agreed. But the lie is already hurting her. At least this would be the truth. Chapter 8. The Encounter. It took Clara 3 months to realize what Giuseppe had done. She finally broke down and looked at the insurance paperwork, the medical care, the specialists, the tests. It was too much. It was impossible. It was the kind of thing that didn't happen to people like her. People didn't just receive things. People didn't just get taken care of. People like her existed to be taken from, not given to. "Who did this?" she asked Giuseppe one afternoon. She was shaking. She was crying. She was overwhelmed by the strangeness of being treated as if she mattered. Why would someone do this? Giuseppe looked at her and made a decision. He had promised Victor silence, but he also understood that some silences were cruelty. Some truths had to be told, no matter the pain they caused. "Someone who needed to," he said. "Someone who needed you to get well. Someone who needed to face what they'd done. I can't tell you more than that, but I think you should listen if they ask to meet with you." The next day, a car waited for Clara after her shift. A black car. Professional. The kind of thing that appeared in her nightmares. The driver said only that someone wanted to meet with her. Clara considered running. She considered calling the police. She was terrified, but she was also tired of not knowing, tired of the mystery, tired of carrying a weight she didn't understand. She got in the car. The penthouse was high above the city. The view was vast. You could see the industrial district where she had grown up, the port where Victor's empire had its foundations, the rain falling on the streets where ordinary people lived their ordinary fragile lives. The space was minimalist and cold, like the home of someone who had decided that beauty was a distraction from the work of survival. Victor was standing at the window when she entered. He didn't turn around at first. He stood there for a long moment, and Clara could see his shoulders move with breath. When he finally turned to face her, he looked older than she expected, smaller, broken in ways that hadn't been visible from a distance. "My name is Victor Corsini," he said. "I know that everyone knows that name. I know what people say about me. I know what I've done." "I know who you are," Clara said quietly. "Everyone knows." "Not like this," Victor said. He stepped closer, not threatening, just present, just trying to be honest. "I know that someone took something from you, without your consent, without your knowledge. I know that you're sick because of that. I know that your life has become smaller and harder because of what was done to you." Clara felt something break open in her chest. Someone had to say it out loud. Someone had to acknowledge that what had happened wasn't an accident, wasn't just medical misfortune, wasn't something that just happened to people. It was a choice made by someone who had power, and she had none. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Her voice was so small. "Because I'm the one who did it," Victor said, "not with my hands, but with the authority that made it possible. I arranged for a kidney to be taken. I bought a kidney for my son. I didn't ask where it came from. I didn't ask if the woman who was selling it understood what she was giving. I didn't ask if she was healthy. I didn't ask anything except if it matched. I just took it because I could, and you're the woman it came from." Clara sat down. Her legs weren't holding her anymore. The room tilted. She felt like she was falling. "Your son is healthy because you're sick," Victor said. "That's the truth. That's the exact truth. His survival was purchased with your health. His future was bought with your diminishment, and I spent 3 months trying to figure out how to live with that truth." "Can you?" Clara asked. She looked at him, and there was no malice in her voice, only exhaustion, only the question of whether anything could ever be enough to balance these scales. "No," Victor said. "I don't think I can, but I'm not asking your forgiveness. I'm asking your help." He told her everything then, about Marco, about the transplant, about the machinery of his power that had made it possible. He told her about his 18 years of believing he was different from other criminals, that his cruelty at least had the excuse of love. He told her about the sleepless nights. He told her about standing outside the diner, watching her work, understanding finally what he had taken from her. "I can't undo this," Victor said, "but I can stop. I can dismantle the parts of my life that would do this again. I can face what I've done. I can try to become something other than what I've built myself into." Clara listened. She didn't speak for a long time. There was so much to process, so much rage and betrayal and violation contained in this man's confession. But there was also something else, something that looked like genuine remorse, like a crack in the fortress of power that might actually be real. "Tell your son," she said finally. Her voice was steady now. "Tell him the truth about where his kidney came from. Tell him about me. Tell him that his life was given to him at someone else's expense, and that the only way to honor that is to not waste it. Tell him that every day he lives is a day bought with someone else's blood." "That's a lot to burden him with," Victor said. "So is living," Clara said. "So is knowing that someone else paid the price for your survival. If he's going to have the life you gave him, he should know what it cost." Chapter 9. The silence after Marco was told the truth on a Saturday morning. They sat in the apartment he had come to think of as a recovery room, a space where his body had learned to trust itself again. His father sat down across from him and told him everything, not sparing the details, not protecting him from the moral weight of it, not softening the edges. Marco listened with his hand on his side, where the new kidney was filtering his blood with every heartbeat. He listened to the story of his survival. He listened to the story of her sacrifice. He listened to his father describe in careful, honest language what it meant to be the kind of man who could justify this, how long it had taken him to understand that justification was no excuse. "Does she want to meet me?" Marco asked when his father finished. "I don't know," Victor said, "but I can ask." Clara said yes. They agreed to meet in a coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. Neutral ground, public, safe. Marco was thin and young and had his mother's gentle eyes. Clara was small and tired and carried herself like someone who had learned not to take up space, like she was apologizing for existing. They sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and neither of them knew what to say. "I'm sorry," Marco said finally. The words felt small and inadequate, but they were what he had. "For what happened to you, for being alive because you're sick." "It wasn't your fault," Clara said. "You were sick. You deserved help." "But not like this," Marco said. He was 17 years old, and he was already learning about the complexities of gratitude mixed with guilt, about the impossibility of enjoying a gift that had been stolen from someone else. "Not at your expense. I would never have chosen this if I knew." "I know," Clara said. "But you didn't get to choose. Your father made that choice for you." They talked for 2 hours. They talked about the hospital, about the recovery, about the strange intimacy of sharing blood without knowing each other. Marco told her that he had decided to study medicine, to work in communities that couldn't afford it, to dedicate his life to healing people like her, people who had been failed by the systems that were supposed to protect them. Clara told him that was good. That was the only kind of redemption possible. Victor watched from across the coffee shop and understood finally what punishment meant. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't violence. It wasn't even justice in any traditional sense. It was the long, quiet confrontation with what you had taken from someone and the impossibility of ever giving it back. It was living with the knowledge that your love for your child had cost someone else their health. It was understanding that power had a price, and that price was always paid by someone else. A year passed. Victor slowly, methodically began to dismantle his empire. He transferred power to men he trusted not to prey on the desperate. He stopped taking. He started giving, to hospitals, to clinics, to the kind of places where people like Clara would be treated with dignity instead of extracted like resources. He didn't become good. That wasn't possible for a man who had spent 23 years building an empire on exploitation. But he became less destructive. He became capable of listening to people who had no power over him. He became someone who could sit in silence with another person and let the weight of what he had done be the only conversation that mattered. He became someone who understood that forgiveness wasn't something he deserved, and that understanding was the closest he could get to redemption. Clara recovered slowly. Her remaining kidney stabilized at 72% capacity. The medical specialists found treatments that allowed her to work, to live, to move through her days with less pain. Giuseppe increased her hours at the diner, and she began to save money for the first time in her life. She opened a savings account. She allowed herself to imagine a future. She didn't forgive Victor. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give, and she was honest enough to know that. But she acknowledged him. She saw him for what he was, a man learning too late that power is meaningless without mercy, that control is a cage you build for yourself, that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about transforming how you move forward. One evening, Clara was closing the diner, turning off the neon signs one by one. The rain was falling softly, and the city lights were reflecting on the wet asphalt, creating patterns of light and darkness. Victor appeared at the window, his hands in his pockets, his face reflecting the quiet exhaustion of a man who had finally stopped running. She opened the door. Neither of them spoke. They stood in the rain for a moment, Clara inside the diner, Victor outside in the cold, and then he turned and walked away. Not because he was forgiven, but because he understood that some debts can never be repaid, only acknowledged. That some prices can never be reversed, only honored. The kidney inside Marco's body continued to beat, continued to filter, continued to give him a life that had cost someone else nearly everything. And maybe that was the real redemption. Not that he could repay what had been taken, but that he would spend his life understanding the price of his own survival, and make sure that price was never asked of anyone else again. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of the waitress who donated her kidney unknowingly. The patient was the Mafia boss's son in critical need. See you in the next one.